This is Haunted America Radio with your host, Al Shepard. And now, Haunted America Radio.
Hello, everyone. I know it's been a while, but hey, summer's made for being outside. As it gets colder, I'll get in the studio more. Today, my guest is Pat Fitzhugh. Hailing from the land of moonshine and grits, Pat is best known for his research of the Bell Witch case and his books about the history, legends, and lore of the American South. Now, Pat says, I take yarns of history, legends, and tragedies and weave them into stories that not only entertain, but provide a glimpse into the region's people and past. Injecting history and culture into ghost stories evokes a tingling sense of realism that makes them more terrifying. Now, Pat Fitzhugh was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and split his childhood between Humphreys County, Tennessee, and Nashville's West Side. He became interested in ghost stories early on in his life, and his early influences included the local horror show Creature Feature and a host of old late-night British ghost movies. He, of course, became interested in Tennessee's Bell Witch legend, and his research of the infamous case now spans 46 years. Over his career thus far, Pat has written more than 50 short stories, articles, and books about ghosts and life in the South. His articles have appeared in major newspapers and leading magazines such as Women's World, Esquire, and the Journal of Southern Folklore. In 1999, he wrote a condensed version of the Bell Witch legend entitled The Bell Witch Haunting. In the years since its release, 2 movies have used its title. In the fall of 2000, Fitzhugh released The Bell Witch, The Full Account, a historical and journalistic analysis of America's most terrifying ghost story. The book garnered rave reviews from well-respected ghost researchers around the globe and twice appeared on the state of Tennessee's suggested teen summer reading list. Updated editions of the full account were published in 2003, 2012, and 2021. In 2002, Pat co-produced 2 Bell Witch festivals, one in Mississippi and one in Adams, Tennessee. Now, all of Pat's fine research have landed him on many radio, TV, and movie roles. He's appeared in Small Town Monsters' documentary movie, The Mark of the Bell Witch. He was also a host on A&E's 2015 hit TV series, Cursed, The Bell Witch. His other film credits include Night Visitors on the Learning Channel, Liars and Legends on Turner South, and The Most Terrifying Places in America 2 on the Travel Channel. In 2006, he appeared in the motion picture DVD An American Haunting, starring Sissy Spacek and Donald Sutherland. He's also appeared on Halloween specials televised by the BBC and CNN. His radio credits include appearances on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell, Ground Zero, The John Boy and Billy Show, and numerous podcasts and local television shows, like this one. Today, Pat resides in the Nashville, Tennessee area, like me. He's a licensed ham radio operator, like me. And he's a pilot, not like me. And he volunteers his time working with emergency management groups and serving as a train host, again, like me, for a Nashville-based train excursion company. I hope you enjoy this interview with Pat Fitzhugh as we discuss the legend of the Bell Witch. All right, Pat, first I want to thank you for joining me. We're going to talk about a topic tonight that I've never had on the show before, which is the Bell Witch. So for people who have maybe never heard of the Bell Witch, can you give us a quick rundown on exactly what the story is?
Sure, I'll be glad to, and thank you for having me on the show. The legend of the Bell Witch centers on the John Bell family of northwestern Middle Tennessee, Robertson County, Tennessee, who were forced to endure a series of very strange and often tormenting disturbances at the hand of an allegedly invisible entity. All of this between the years of 1817 and 1821. Early on, There were a few outdoor manifestations, such as when the family's father, John Bell, encountered a strange looking rabbit dog type animal in his cornfield, followed by the older sons seeing a very large, strange bird that fled as soon as they tried to point a gun at it. And then the youngest daughter, Elizabeth, and some of her brothers finding a strange looking, very scary looking old lady hanging from a tree in the woods. And shortly after that, the family began seeing what they described as candle lights flickering in the woods or at the edge of the field by the woods. They did not know what these things were. It was more like they were eyes watching them. And the slaves on the farm referred to those apparitions as dead man's candles. An apparition, if you will, that someone was about to die. Well, that didn't happen in the Bell family, at least not at that point. But those were called dead man's candles. And then as autumn of 1827 rolled in and the nights became colder and more windy, the family began hearing what they described as knocks on the wall and doors, the sound of chains being dragged across the floor of their home, and also the sounds of what they described as stones being dropped on the roof of their large log home. And Mr. Bell and his sons would send people outside, in hopes of catching a culprit, such as a neighborhood kid or maybe the slaves just playing tricks. But a culprit was never found. And after this went on for several months, the family became more and more concerned as these disturbances, which some people describe as poltergeist like, continued to happen with more frequency and intensity. And it got to the point where the family were kept up all night, every night. They were scared to death. They didn't know what this thing was at all. They knew it was definitely much stronger than they were. And people in the neighborhood started talking about the Bells and why they couldn't seem to get around or do anything during the day. They just seemed like they were sleepy or in a trance. So, it came to the point where Mr. Bell had to share this information with his best friend and neighbor, James Johnson. And Mr. Johnson thought that there was, some type of spirit or something involved, like a spirit from the Bible. And the spirit was possibly trying to tell them something. So he and Mr. Bell, at Mr. Johnson's urging, went to see the pastor of Red River Baptist Church. And the three men agreed to try and find out and eradicate what this thing was. And above all else, to keep its existence a secret. This was something John Bell did not want getting out anywhere. This was only 125 years after the Salem witch trials. We were in the buckle of the Bible Belt. Other strange things had happened, like the New Madrid earthquake and other things that put a lot of people in the fear of the Almighty. And John Bell happened to be an elder of the Red River Baptist Church. And one could only imagine what would have happened to Mr. Bell if people found out there was an entity, most likely a malevolent entity, living in his home. So the men swore this to secrecy. Well, within a week, people were coming from all over Middle Tennessee and southern Kentucky to see what was going on at the Bell home. And meanwhile, as more and more people visited, some who were believers, others who were skeptics, this entity or thing grew. It seemed to feed off of people's fear and attention. And it reached the point where people could hear whispers. They were not, at that time, discernible. But over time, as more people came, the more strength this thing got, and it finally developed a discernible voice. People would ask this thing what it was, why it was there, and it would tell stories each time, claiming to be the spirit of somebody buried in the woods nearby. the spirit of a Native American looking for a lost tooth from its skull, the spirit of a trapper who had been killed in the woods after having buried a big chest of treasure up under a rock, and that it would leave if Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter, could have that treasure. Just all kinds of things to send these people on a wild goose chase. And you've got to remember, they were terrified. This thing was invisible. Nobody could see it. They could only hear it or see the force of what it could do, like making doors shut, the banging on the walls, and even to the point of pulling the bed covers back when the children tried to sleep in their beds. And at one point, it allegedly slapped Betsy Bell in her sleep. Well, over time, this thing continued to grow. And around 1819, a man in the American Army, Major General Andrew Jackson, heard about it and wanted to investigate. Now, the Bells and Jackson weren't strangers. Jackson did, in fact, own a horse farm where he raised racing horses, only a mile or two from the Bell home. And on top of that, two, possibly three of the oldest Bell sons had fought under Jackson in the War of 1812, at the battles of Horseshoe Bend and the Battle of New Orleans. So there's an old story out there about General Jackson encountering the so-called Bell Witch and it making him leave. It's probably too much detail for a short version of the Bell Witch, but that story's out there. And of course, during my research, I found that there's no evidence he really ever encountered the Bell Witch, but he certainly could have been at the Bell Farm. And then as people continued to ask this thing what it was, and it continued to give bogus answers, at one point, one of the preachers asked him, who are you, what do you want? And in such a way that the truth was the only option. And the thing responded that it was old Kate Batts's witch, and it was there to torment John Bell to his death. Well, people seemed to buy that. Why? Kate Batts was a lady whose family lived about 2 miles, or maybe more like a mile and a half from the Bell Farm. Her husband, Frederick Batts, had suffered a very serious injury doing some logging work a few years earlier and was an invalid, thereby leaving Mrs. Batts and her children to run their farm. They did not have enough money to afford slaves, and Mrs. Batts was somewhat looked down upon or made fun of by many in the community due to her financial status and reportedly very strange ways. So when this entity revealed that it was Kate Batts's witch, people were like, well, okay, this story makes sense because that lady's crazy. She's bonkers. Well, research has shown that she wasn't crazy or bonkers and didn't have anything to do with any of this. But nevertheless, she received the early blame, and people started calling this entity Kate. Shortly after that time, the entity put in more apparition-type disturbances. In one case, the children saw a very strange-looking and misbehaving rabbit on the way home from school, walking through the woods down a little country lane. And this rabbit was almost like trying to play tricks on them or harass them. And that evening, this thing's voice spoke up and said that it had been the rabbit. Also, about the same time, at the farm of Esther Bell, who was the Bell's oldest daughter, who had already moved away by the time disturbances began, there were 4 distinct entities appearing across the road from Esther Bell and Alex Porter's farm. They were seen by Esther Bell and Betsy's Bell. It was a very pale-looking older lady who appeared very frail and very afraid. And she had with her 3 children, 2 little girls and a little boy. And they stood right in front of the cabin up there on the lane. They didn't do anything. They just stared off in the distance. Then they went into the field and started playing on saplings. They would bend the saplings over, where they were far enough bent over that somebody could sit on them. Then they would sit on them and bounce them up and down. And I'm sure a lot of people know what I'm talking about. And I grew up partially in the country. I used to do that all the time myself. And as they were doing that, Alex Porter came home, and his wife, Esther Bell, and then Esther's little sister, Betsy, pointed this out, and he couldn't see anything. He saw the saplings going up and down, but nothing there. He got his gun ready to shoot, and these things took cover behind a log. He fired a shot, nothing happened. Then that night, the entity revealed that he had broken the arm of Jerusalem from 75 yards out. And it named off these characters or these apparitions that Esther Bell and her husband and sister saw that day. The leader, the older lady, called herself Black Dog. Then the two little girls, one was referred to as mathematics, the other was referred to as topography, and the little boy was referred to as Jerusalem. And for 3 weeks, disembodied voices in the Bell home and homes in the surrounding area were not just the old, what we would call the Kate voice or the Bell Witch voice, but the voices of these four distinct characters talking. And then that stopped. And as I mentioned, this thing said that its job was to kill John Bell. Well, no, studying the legend, or anybody that's even read it for that matter, knows that much of the physical torment and physical violence was centered on John Bell and his daughter Betsy Bell. They bore the brunt of the physical disturbances, even though others were physically disturbed as well. It's very interesting to note that this thing seemed to be very fond of the mother of the family, Lucy Bell. It knew exactly where to go to get her grapes and hazelnuts when she was sick. It would even sing hymns to her. It seemed to love her. Also, this thing was very partial to a neighbor named Calvin Johnson. Calvin was the son of James Johnson, one of two sons. And it proclaimed in some of its nightly demonstrations, vocal demonstrations, I might add, that Calvin Johnson was the sweetest and nicest man, finest man who ever lived. And there's the old story that Calvin Johnson was the only man ever who was allowed to shake hands with the so-called Bell Witch. Well, about that time, Betsy Bell became engaged to a local boy named Joshua Gardner. Everybody was happy about that. And I'm sure Betsy was probably happiest because maybe she could finally move away and escape all of this constant, relentless torment that she was expecting. Well, apparently Kate did not like this. Kate told Betsy over and over, "Don't marry Joshua Gardner." And meanwhile, Mr. Bell had begun to complain about a lot of pain and twitching in his face, and his mouth feeling like there was a piece of wood in it anytime he swallowed food. And these symptoms, which appear to be symptomatic of a nervous system issue, worsened over time. And by early December of 1820, Mr. Bell could not even leave the house. He was very sick. By that time, he was even having seizures. All the while, with the entity known as Kate taking credit for it, saying he was a bad man and that he needed to die. Then on December 20th, 1820, Mr. Bell died. And the entity called Kate laughed and rejoiced and even said that she poisoned him with a liquid that she put in a vial on the cupboard, and which the family had given Mr. Bell, or she had given Mr. Bell, but which the family thought was medicine to make him feel better. And John Bell's funeral was one of the largest ever held in Robertson County, And according to the legend, this entity laughed and cackled and sang until the very last mourner had left the graveyard. Well, after Mr. Bell passed away, and in the winter of 1821, much of the trouble and the disturbances subsided a great deal. Things had become much quieter. It was though a lot of weight had been lifted off the shoulders of the Bell family and even those around in, say, a 6 square mile radius where these disturbances occurred. A lot of weight lifted off their shoulders. But the entity wasn't gone completely. In April, the Monday after Easter of April 1821, at a community picnic, Betsy Bell and her suitor, Joshua Gardner, were fishing and eating picnic food when they began hearing a familiar voice, the voice of Kate, screaming into Betsy's ear, saying, "Please, please don't marry Joshua Gardner. He will never be good for you. Ever. Don't marry Joshua." Well, at that point, Betsy had had enough. And knowing what had happened to her father at the hands of Kate, she didn't want to chance the same thing happening to Joshua. So she broke it off with Joshua. They went their own separate ways. Joshua soon thereafter relocated to Western Tennessee. And in June of 1821, the entity known as Kate bade farewell to the Bell family, but said she would come back in 7 years. And in 7 years, there's the story of her return, and she returned to John Bell Jr., who was living in a cabin on a farm right next to the original Bell farm. In fact, it had been part of the original Bell farm, but after his father died, he moved out and moved to this section of the farm. And for a period of 3 nights, the voice of Kate and John Bell Jr. had discussions about the past, the present, and the future. And a number of predictions were made by Kate, some of which came true, some of which did not come true. But it was a very interesting time. And then Kate bade farewell to John Jr., promising to return again in 107 years to John Bell's most direct descendant. So that is the very basic, I would say, highly abbreviated version of the legend of the Bell Witch. And as to whether she returned in, 107 years, which would have been 1935, we don't know. My mother was born and grew up right there at Ground Zero. She said they had too much to worry about, having been going through the Great Depression to even be thinking about the Bell Witch. Some say she returned. And a lot of people say she never left the place because it always seems something really strange is going on there. Of course, nothing along the magnitude of what we're told happened to John Bell and Betsy Bell, 200 years ago. But the place has always been known as a very strange and eerie place.
Um, that is an incredible story. I don't even know where to start here. Um, so it started originally with poltergeist type activity, which we know are usually centered around adolescents or teenagers. So what's your thoughts on that theory of it possibly being Betsy herself causing that?
Well, looking at the characteristics of the various disturbances that occurred over the 4 year timeline, you see characteristics of several different, what we call paranormal or supernatural entities at play, different ones at different times. The earliest disturbances, those type disturbances were obviously very poltergeist in nature. Noisy ghost, poltergeist, you're talking a type of entity that is essentially a ball of malevolent entity. It has no intelligence, it just has strength, but it can be directed by the human mind. And that's where we get into like the agent of the poltergeist, in this case, the adolescent. Some studies had been done, one by Nander Fodor, the Hungarian lawyer who also claimed to be a parapsychologist, saying that most all of the cases of poltergeist that he investigated, there was always a juvenile by or an adolescent person nearby, and he felt there was a connection between the adolescent, the changing of hormones during that period in somebody's life, and how that can affect brain waves and malform certain brain waves and possibly send out negative energy for what amounts to mind over matter and make things move. Then fast forward to the 1960s, and the parapsychology department at North Carolina, University of North Carolina, which had the first parapsychology department and serious study in the country, then under the direction of Dr. William Roll, came up with a theory after other studies that the term for this would be recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. In other words, at any time, for any reason, the mind over matter, the malformed brain waves would do the mind over matter and manipulate and cause things to move. And usually from the mind of an adolescent, especially one that had been suffering some type of severe trauma. So, in effect, this thing, if you want to look at it from poltergeist theory, it could have been Betsy's mind creating this poltergeist, where she was the agent, and she may have had no idea whatsoever that her mind was creating this thing. It was unknown to her, but her mind was doing this, over and over, different times, and just, spontaneously. RSPK, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. And over the years, several people have taken that theory and run with it and tried to plug in, I would call some sub theories with it, or, when they try unsuccessfully to explain what really happened there, they will go after that poltergeist theory. And, for me, I think poltergeist would apply to some of the earlier disturbances, but over time, we saw this thing, most importantly, develop intelligence. It could carry on communications with people. A preacher could say any verse from the Bible, and this thing could argue with the preacher about it or provide another Bible verse that seemed to contradict the one the preacher said. So this thing, to me, had quite a bit of intelligence, and it could tell people about their past as well. So that transcends or goes beyond your senseless, malevolent energy poltergeist into something more of like a spiritual type entity, and not necessarily a good or benevolent spiritual entity. There are evil spirits too. And then also some of the situations where Betsy would be abused, she would go into trances beforehand, or sometimes after the different abuses where she was hit and beaten. Those type of things happening there, plus this family I talked about of the old lady and the three children, and there was a hierarchy there. Then we talk about all these cases where this thing apparently had a genius level knowledge of scripture that points to demonics.
That was my next question. Yes.
Right. And I am definitely no demonologist, so I can't go into a whole lot of detail about that, but I'm saying that's another characteristic that was displayed over this 4-year period.
Yeah, that's what the last thing I wrote actually was demonic / Satan, because it
Yeah.
seems to me if anyone's going to have the ability to know all the answers and come up with all the alternative Bible verses and all that stuff, that's who it would be. So, uh, because yeah, to me the poltergeist thing doesn't pan out when you get into the later years where you're, like you said, having conversations and
Yeah.
things like that. Um, and as far as Kate Batts, was she alive at this point? I mean,
Yes, she was very much alive.
so how can you have someone's ghost if they're still alive?
Yeah, you know,
Are we talking astral projection here or something, or
I
out of
don't
body
know, but
experiences?
the whole Kate Batts thing, it was not even in the original story of the Bell Witch. The
Okay.
original story of it was not even in there. But then in 1894, a fictional account, or mostly fictional account, as we have been able to find through research, came out. And that was the first account saying anything about Kate Batts being accused of being the Bell Witch. In
Okay,
reality,
that's probably the story I heard, because I heard something about a bad land deal where
yeah,
where
that's
John Bell had screwed her over or something.
yeah. Unfortunately, even though that's a fictional account, people don't care. Whatever they hear or read, and if it feels good, they go with it and they believe it and they worship it just like the cycles would. Even if it's a completely or partially fictional account. What happened with Kate Batts, the whole land deal, I can explain all that. Uh, I actually found all that very easily through research. It's all there. Uh, First of all, the whole Kate Batts land deal and coming back to haunt John Bell and his family, that was debunked. And the debunking of that was actually published in the year 2000, which was the first edition of The Bell Witch, the Full Account, which was the first Bell Witch book that came out that was based on extensive research, more so than folklore. But nevertheless, there are some people out there that still think Kate Batts was behind it. It's crazy, but what's that old saying? I don't care because I know the truth. I found it. So here's the deal. A little while, within a couple of years leading up to the haunting period, the Red River Baptist Church minutes show that Mr. Bell and another member named Josiah Fort, who happened to be the brother of the pastor, were not in fellowship. And as with many cases back then, they did not go to court. The church heard the cases. And there was a hearing about the two men not being in fellowship. And it resulted,
So define for today's audience who might not even know what that means. Define what not being in fellowship is.
they have a disagreement, have it out for each other.
Okay.
And what happened there is Josiah Fort ended up having to pull his membership from the Red River Baptist Church, and he went to another church up just over the Kentucky line. He didn't come back till after John Bell had died in 1820. Um, some say it was because of this, the not being in fellowship. Mr. Bell. Others say he had some other issues because at the time we were into this salvation versus predestination and Calvinism debate and even turmoil within the Baptist Church. We had Primitive Baptist Church, then we had Free Will Baptist. The Baptist religion was splitting off based along these beliefs of, predestination versus salvation. And the church that Josiah Fort went to was the Calvinistic church. So, some people say it all had to do with that, even though, like I say, after John Bell died, he returned back to the Red River Baptist Church, which followed the salvation doctrine, and he himself ended up becoming the preacher at one point. So, at any rate, how all this ties back to Kate Batts. Researchers years later were looking through the church minutes and found where the subject of the unfellowship between Mr. Bell and Mr. Fort had been stricken, had been marked through in the church records. Well, after a lot of magnifying glass examination and no telling what, because I was not there when that researcher did that, it was determined that this was about a property line. And if you go back and look at some actual civil court records from that time and a little later, you can find, if you look very carefully, that Josiah Fort was no stranger to property line disputes. So, what we have here is a property line dispute right before the haunting with Josiah Fort. Then we have a business dispute, again with Mr. Bell, this time with Benjamin Batts. This was over the sale of a slave. Mr. Batts felt that Mr. Bell charged too much interest, and he went before the church and charged him with usury, the crime of charging too much interest. And there were also a couple of other charges, I think covetousness and some other things, levied against Mr. Bell. Keep in mind, Benjamin Batts was the brother of Frederick Batts. That was Kate Batts' brother-in-law, not Kate Batts, not even Kate Batts' husband. So we've got that. The church ruled in Mr. Bell's favor. Well, Mr. Batts didn't like that, so he took the matter to the civil court, the circuit court there in Robertson County. The circuit court found Bell guilty of charging too much interest. So then the Red River Baptist Church kind of backpedals and says, okay, one of our elders was found guilty of something in court. That embarrasses us. He is hereby excommunicated. So at that point, John Bell was kicked out of the church for something that the church had found him not guilty of earlier. So, and of course, you've got people that are saying that the real reason behind Mr. Bell's excommunication was that they just could not stand the idea of one of their elders having a malevolent supernatural entity living in his home. But all the records point to his excommunication being the result of his dispute with Benjamin Batts. So you take the dispute with Benjamin Batts, then you take the bad property deal with Josiah Fort, put it in an old kettle like a witch's brew and stir it up, let it simmer for a couple of 100 years. What are you going to have? You're going to have a fake theory that John Bell had a property line dispute with Kate Batts, and as a result, she came back from the dead to haunt him. That's how all that happened.
Makes a good movie script.
Yeah, a lot of mix-ups. People hearing property line dispute, then they hear bad slave deal. They hear the name Batts, and then this guy who wrote the mostly fictional account on the Bell Witch brought up Kate Batts' name for the first time. Put all those words in a kettle and stir it up, let it simmer. There you go. So that's where that came from. And another thing I'll point out is that probably the largest or most popular Kate Batts theory is that she came back from the dead to haunt him. In reality, Kate Batts outlived John Bell by 23 years. She did not come back to haunt him. She couldn't have. So you've got that. Now, there's another Kate Batts theory out there that Kate Batts was still to blame for all of this, but she was alive, but practicing what was referred to, or what's referred to now as black magic, a form of witchcraft and spells that inflict bad things, bad vibes, bad misfortunes on others. Of course, we don't know that. We don't know,
Yeah.
there's not any indication that Kate Batts really had anything to do with this at all.
I mean, if it that might hold some water if it was limited to just John Bell and maybe Betsy, but you said neighbors and everything else were having different episodes and things like that. So that
Yeah,
kind of
the
blows
Bell,
that theory out in my
yeah,
mind.
Yeah,
Um,
and the epicenter seemed to be there. Of course, they're on the Bell Farm, but people in about a 6 square mile area had reported happenings, and if the Bells would go see neighbors, this thing would follow them sometimes.
yeah, so I mean, you were saying that a lot of times they would get different stories. They would say they were one person at one time and another person at another time. So that doesn't sound like someone that's out to get revenge and wants you to know exactly who they are. So um, that again sounds more like Satan to me if you're going to just make up crap every different time you talk. Um,
Yeah,
the the mother and the kid, three kids. I mean that the part of that story I don't get is if you're a ghost or a spirit or whatever, why are you going to take cover if somebody points a gun at you, and how are you going to break someone's arm?
yeah. The whole thing about the older lady and the three little kids that is referred to as the witch family incident, and you know yeah, if these things were apparitions and they were ghostly apparitions, which that's what you think of when you see an apparition, a ghost or a doppelganger or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Why is a bullet going to affect them?
Yeah.
Why would they need to take cover? Then again, maybe they're not intelligent ghosts and they didn't realize what was going on. That they were invincible from a physical standpoint.
And how is the Bell daughters only the one? They're the only two that can see him, but the husband can't.
Yeah, I know that's something that makes some people wonder, why, is this something that only was experienced by people with the Bell and the Bell bloodline?
Mm-hmm.
But other people experienced it too, just not as bad as the Bells did. But on
Right.
that day, Esther's husband did not see it at all.
That's
And
just
I'll and I'll
one
also
more part of it that doesn't make sense.
right, and this was one of the many stories that came out in that mostly fictional account, which make up the basis of most of the Bell Witch story we know today, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so yeah, I'm
Very
already learning.
entertaining.
I'm already learning that what I thought I knew, I can pretty much throw 99% of that out the window. Um, and and the weird names of those kids, and I mean, just where did where the heck do you come up with those names?
Well, you know,
Apocrypha was one of them, and
Psypocryphy,
Psypocryphy. Okay.
there are a couple of definitions for that. It's a very obscure word. One has to do with the state of conversation, multiple conversations taking place at once. For example, if there's a meeting hall and they're between sessions and a whole lot of people are standing around talking, and you hear all these different echoes all over the room of people's voices, but you don't necessarily know who it is because there's so many people talking in the room, that is psypocryphy. Psypocryphy is also a very obscure mathematics term, a very obscure and deals with a part of mathematics that I'm not the least bit familiar with. So
Mm-hmm.
I can't really go
And
into that too much. I'm
and
just
one of the other names was mathematics too, right?
right, and that's what gets me about the whole witch family incident. I don't know where the story writer came up with these names, but if there really was such an incident, regardless of whether it was apparitions or humans were behind it or what, I find it ironic that two of those names happen to do with mathematics.
Yeah,
I mean,
which I would think it was not really a big topic back in those days.
no,
Uh,
not with most people. I mean,
yeah,
farming, it was an agricultural area. Farming was the really big topic, and you think about this thing, who in the heck would have been running around Red River being a math genius, knowing everybody's business and everybody's past and all that. I mean, it kind of doesn't make sense. You ask that question, though, several things can come to mind.
Yeah, and you said even someone even shook hands with this entity.
Yes,
How did that work?
one of the stories says that Calvin Johnson shook hands with this thing. He did not see it, but he felt the hand.
Oh,
He
okay.
said the hand felt cold, very feeble, and a little slimy.
A little slimy. Okay. Kind of like the ghost of an old woman, huh?
Cold and
Um,
feeble is what it said. Mhm.
uh, yeah, I. So I guess let me just ask you, since you've done all this research for what 40 years or however long. Um,
46 this year.
okay, so sort it out for us. What do you think is the truth in all this mess?
Okay, that's going to be hard to do.
So you're not even sure either, huh?
No, I'm 100%, but
Okay.
I'm saving that for a future book.
Okay, well, don't
But
I don't want you to give away
I
any
can,
spoilers. You'll have to
I
give us the name of the books though, so we can read it and figure it
yeah,
out.
I have a, yeah, I have an answer to that question though. I can go by. What do I think the Bell Witch is? I think the Bell Witch case does have a basis. I don't feel that that basis is necessarily what many accounts say. I think it went back to a couple of very simple things, but which were very hard to understand back then and are even hard to understand now, which created a lot of localized hysteria, which in turn drew a lot of regionalized and beyond attention. And over time, the case has been embellished by different people telling it and different people writing about it into something much larger than it really was. But I do think some things happened. I'm not going to say whether they were supernatural in nature or caused by humans, but they definitely got this story to going. And as far as the Bell Witch, is it real? Was it real? I think it was very real to everyone who experienced it and is very real to those who still say that they experience it today.
So basically, we're talking like Salem witch trial hysteria type thing here to begin with.
Well, not quite that intense, and yeah, definitely on the local level.
Right.
Some people have wanted to attach the term mass hysteria to the Bell Witch phenomenon, and I would tend to call it local hysteria. The hysteria was shared among the people that encountered this thing,
Hmm.
but when it came to the masses, it wasn't hysteria as much as it was simple curiosity.
You
Attention
got
in the form of curiosity. Is
right.
this real? What's going on? And then, skeptics coming in to try to debunk it.
Well, you said way back that originally they didn't want this getting out and they wanted to keep it quiet, but then apparently it didn't stay quiet for long.
No, it didn't. Yeah, you know, they swore it to secrecy, then all of a sudden everybody started coming from everywhere. Yeah,
Yeah.
somebody let the
Well,
cat out of the bag.
I was
You
gonna
don't know
say,
who.
you know how secrets are. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like today. Just like
Yeah.
today. You're going to keep something a secret. Next thing you know, everybody hears about it.
Yep. So I'm leaning toward the demonic slash Satan type thing. Um, so we need to know. Uh, I mentioned in your intro some of your books, but give me a refresher on what books and what websites and things you've already got out there that people can go to right now while we're waiting for your next book with all the answers that we all want. Uh,
Okay, I had written a book called The Bell Witch Haunting. I've since taken that out of publication. It was from back in the 90s, and it was a holdover book until The Bell Witch, The Full Account first edition came out. So there's the book, The Bell Witch, The Full Account. The first edition was almost 25 years ago, but it has been updated numerous times since then. I keep that book, my whole thing, I keep the book current and relevant by updating it periodically based on new findings and new conclusions through my research. So it's the Bell Witch, the full account. Online retailers have it, and some traditional book and mortar bookstores carry it as well. If somebody wants to get a signed, personalized copy from the author, they could go to my Bell Witch site at www.bellwitch.org and click the link there to order, signed and personalized copies. Signed and personalized copies are also available at events I do. I have a few coming up. They've got one August 30th. No books there. This is a paranormal investigation up in Smith County, Tennessee, but that one's already sold out. Then in on September 22nd, I'll be up in Adams, Tennessee at the Bell Witch Fall Festival talking about one of the characters in the Bell Witch legend named Professor Richard Powell. He was Betsy Bell's school teacher. He's a very smart man from North Carolina. He was an expert on farming, geology, mathematics, and all sorts of things. And shortly after John Bell died, he ended up courting Betsy and ended up marrying her. But I'll be talking about him at the Bell Witch Fall Festival. Then in October, I think it's October 12th, there's an event coming up. It has not been officially announced just yet, but it is a Nashville area event. It's going to be a very big event. I'll be doing a full lecture, book signing, meet and greet there. Then October 25th, I'll be at the library in Water Valley, Mississippi, where I'll be doing a Bell Witch lecture, Tennessee Bell Witch and Mississippi Bell Witch, book signing and meet and greet. Then from there, I'll be traveling to Little Rock, Arkansas for the Arkansas Paranormal Convention, where I have a perpetual, I guess you would call it, continuous meet and greet and book signing on Saturday the 26th and Sunday the 27th of October. And I'll also be giving a lecture presentation both days. So you can get books at those places as well. I also have another book out called Ghostly Cries from Dixie. It's a collection of ghostly tales and weird locations from all around the American South. You can get that the same place you can the Bell Witch the Full Account through online resellers, some brick and mortar stores, and you can order a copy from me, signed by the author. Not autographed because I'm not famous, but only signed copies. I also have a website out there, my general purpose author website is www.patfitzhugh.com. And of course, I also have to do the social media thing. So I have pages for my books as well as for myself out on Facebook, Instagram, and X, and YouTube, and TikTok, and all the others.
Yeah, you got to have all those, or else you're not complete. All right, so definitely would like to have you back because I think we got more to talk about. Um, so let me just pick your brain real quick before we go. Um, I heard you mention Mississippi Bell Witch. So what are we talking about there?
Okay, some people don't know this, but there are three Bell Witch legends.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. So that's why I said I think we got another show here just about
Yeah,
this. But I
North
just want
Carolina,
to give me a little teaser here.
Tennessee, and Mississippi. The family in the Tennessee Bell Witch legend, which is the longest and most widely known legend telling of the Bell Witch, those people came from North Carolina, but they had problems in North Carolina as well. So there were problems of a different kind, but they were having problems there. And that's where the North Carolina version came from. Now, as for Mississippi, beginning in the mid 1830s, some of John Bell's children, his daughter Esther Bell and her husband Alex Porter, his oldest son Jesse Bell, and his wife moved down to Mississippi, settling near Batesville. Then, years later, some of Betsy Bell and Richard Powell, Professor Richard Powell's children, um, ended up moving down there. And ultimately, Betsy Bell moved down there when she got much older and needed to be taken care of by her daughter. And she's actually buried there in Mississippi, right outside Water Valley, where I'll be doing the lecture. And several of her Betsy Bell relatives are made there. So yeah, in addition to Tennessee, there's two more Bell Witch legends.
Okay, we'll definitely have to pick them up on another episode because that sounds like another whole story we can talk about. And then you just touched on, just for a second, you mentioned something that I think I might have heard of but never paid any attention to, but the New Madrid earthquake. What can tell us in 60 seconds or so? What the heck was that?
A fault line centered on New Madrid, Missouri, erupted in 1811, the winter of 1811 and 1812. Very major earthquake. They say it even rang the Liberty Bell up in Pennsylvania. It made the Mississippi River flow backwards. It created Reelfoot Lake, and it instilled the fear of God into many, many people.
Okay, I'm definitely going to have to look that up too. So you piqued my interest on many things here. So I want to thank you for coming on, and like I said, definitely want to have you back again. Definitely be back with another episode as soon as I am not busy doing 100 other things. But this is my podcast. It's my hobby. I can do it when I want to and not when I don't want to. So.
Okay, great. It's been my pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed it and looking forward to doing it all again sometime.
The big orange monster with not much hair and teeth on his lips. He just stands there. Out in the hall, putting on his shoes. I can tell that he's kinda scared too.
The man with the bomb.
He scares me more.
The man with the stick.
He's under the floor.
The man who is weak.
Who's that at the door?